5 a.m. knock, trembling neighbor, and a warning. She sensed danger. Not knowing survival depended on trust. The knock came like a hammer against the quiet stillness of the early morning, sharp and insistent, shattering the fragile calm of a woman's peaceful sleep. It was 5 a.m., an hour when most of the world still slumbered, unaware of the danger that could be creeping into their lives. Yet this knock carried urgency, a primal demand that something terrible was unfolding just beyond her doorstep. She stirred, heart pounding, an unexplainable sense of alarm gripping her chest. Something about the timing, the force, and the tone of the knock told her instantly that this was no ordinary interruption. Sleep evaporated like mist, leaving her senses sharpened and alive, a mixture of dread and adrenaline coursing through her veins. When she opened the door, her neighbor stood there, wide-eyed and visibly shaking, a man who normally projected calm confidence, now reduced to a trembling, desperate figure. Sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the chill of dawn, and his hands were clasped together, twisting nervously. The look on his face was one of raw, unfiltered fear, the kind of fear that penetrates every bone and marrow, leaving a chilling residue in the room. "Don't go to work today," he urged, his voice quivering, almost breaking. "Just trust me." The words were brief, but they carried the weight of a warning forged in terror. He did not explain. He could not explain. The enormity of what he knew, what he feared, was too dangerous to speak aloud. The urgency in his tone was undeniable, demanding compliance without question. Her mind raced. At first, she wanted to dismiss it. Early morning knocks often heralded mundane news. Packages, forgotten errands, neighborhood issues. But something about this felt different. The tremor in his voice, the way his eyes darted nervously toward the street, the tightness in his posture, told a story her instincts immediately understood. This was a warning born from knowledge. A warning born from fear for her life. It wasn't just the words, it was the energy of panic radiating from him, a vibration that resonated deep within her own body. She asked why, her voice calm but edged with tension. "Why shouldn't I go to work?" Her neighbor froze, and for a moment no sound came. Then, with a shake of his head and a glance over his shoulder as if someone, or something, could be watching, he whispered, "You'll understand by noon." And just like that, the first thread of dread wrapped itself around her chest. Noon. That wasn't just a time. It was a countdown. It was a deadline, and she felt, instinctively, that whatever he knew would manifest into something catastrophic if she ignored his warning. The warning at 5 a.m. is unlike any other. It carries with it a sense of immediate danger. It is the hour when people are most vulnerable, least prepared, and most likely to follow routine. By catching her at this precise hour, he ensured that the message landed directly in the most critical moment of her awareness. The knock was not just a gesture, it was a lifeline, a tether thrown across a dangerous abyss that she could not yet see. To ignore it would be to gamble with her life. As she absorbed the enormity of the situation, her heart raced faster, but her mind sharpened. Fear is often paralyzing, but this was different. This fear was instructive. It demanded attention, assessment, and cautious preparation. She scanned the street outside her home, observing the usual stillness of dawn, the faint glow of streetlights fading with the approaching sunrise. Everything seemed normal, too normal, but her neighbor's terror suggested a hidden reality, a layer of danger beneath the mundane calm. She realized immediately that the threat was unseen, yet present. The danger was deliberate, calculated, and timed. Her neighbor's body language was impossible to ignore. His hands trembled as he adjusted his jacket, as if the motion could shield him from the invisible weight pressing down upon them both. His breathing was ragged, uneven, punctuated by sharp intakes that hinted at panic just below the surface. He did not meet her eyes fully, instead constantly glancing toward the street, toward the empty sidewalks, as though the danger could appear at any second. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to trust his warning. The fear in his eyes was authentic, rooted in knowledge, and reinforced by the peril he could not openly describe. She closed the door slowly, taking a moment to steady herself, but the words continued to echo in her mind. Don't go to work. Just trust me. She tried to rationalize, to find some explanation that would make the situation less terrifying, but none existed. She could feel the urgency in her veins, the primal pull of survival instincts awakening. The ordinary structures of reason and logic began to yield to something deeper. A visceral understanding that her neighbor's terror was a reflection of a truth too dangerous to reveal prematurely. Every second that passed after his departure felt heavy with anticipation. The air of the neighborhood seemed thicker, charged with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She replayed the encounter over and over in her mind, analyzing every detail, every nuance of fear in his expression. Each micro-movement, every glance, every faltering syllable of his voice became a piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to perceive. She understood that what she didn't know was potentially lethal, and that her neighbor's fear was the key to unlocking the danger she could not yet see. By 6 a.m., the knock had become a symbol in her mind, an emblem of imminent peril and a call to vigilance. She moved deliberately through her home, checking doors, windows, and locks, scanning the environment for any clue that might hint at the unseen threat. The ordinary light of early morning offered no comfort, only shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in anticipation of what might come. She recognized that the warning she received was not just a suggestion, it was a directive, an urgent call to action that required total compliance if she hoped to survive what lay ahead. Throughout the hours, the memory of her neighbor's wide, terrified eyes haunted her. Fear, she realized, is often the messenger of survival. When expressed with authenticity, it carries a weight that no rational argument can counter. The combination of his trembling voice, the abruptness of his warning, and his inability to explain himself coalesced into an undeniable truth. Something catastrophic was scheduled to unfold that morning, and she was the intended target if she followed her normal routine. She understood, in a way that bypassed thought and intuition, that the 5 a.m. warning was her lifeline. It was the first strike of awareness against a force she could not yet name. A signal that her life depended on heeding the terror she witnessed in another human being. The knock, the trembling, the whispered words, all formed a map of impending danger she had to navigate with precision. Ignoring it was unthinkable. Questioning it was a luxury she could not afford. Compliance was her only tool, and trust in her neighbor's fear was the weapon that might save her. By the time the sun began to rise, spilling pale light across the quiet street, she had internalized the warning. Every movement was cautious, every sound examined. She understood that danger often hides in the shadows of routine, in the spaces we assume are safe, and she had been given a gift many never receive: a glimpse of the storm before it strikes. The 5 a.m. knock was not just a warning, it was a shield, a call to survive, a signal that her fate could still be altered by the smallest act of vigilance and trust. In that moment, she realized something crucial: fear, when wielded as a messenger, is more powerful than panic. Knowledge, conveyed through terror, could save her life, and this early morning encounter would define the choices she would make over the next hours, shaping the battle between survival and oblivion. The 5 a.m. warning was the first act in a story that had already begun, a story where every second mattered, and where her next decision could mean the difference between life and death. The knock, the trembling, the whispered warning, they were all signs that she was being prepared, not just for danger, but for the clarity and resilience she would need to face the unseen threat. And as the minutes passed, she understood the depth of what her neighbor risked, simply to ensure she heeded the warning, and the weight of responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. Trusting him was no longer optional, it was survival. The look in his eyes was something she could never unsee. It wasn't the fleeting worry that comes from mundane life or minor mistakes. It was raw, unfiltered terror, the kind that strikes through muscle and bone and lodges deep in the soul. His pupils were wide, dilated with a panic that made him seem almost unrecognizable. This man, normally composed, calm, in control, had become a creature entirely at the mercy of some invisible horror. Every tremor in his hands, every twitch of his jaw, every hesitant word carried a message far more potent than his whispered warning: the danger is real, and it is closer than we dare imagine. He refused to explain fully, and that refusal was itself a statement. There are some truths so lethal, so meticulously designed, that even speaking them aloud could accelerate the collapse of the carefully plotted scheme. She understood this instinctively. As she stared at him, a shiver ran down her spine. His eyes darted around nervously, scanning the empty street, the silent houses, the dim glow of early morning. It wasn't fear of her or of being caught. It was fear of something unseen, deliberate and deadly, something he knew was set in motion and timed to perfection. He whispered fragments of sentences, words broken by gasps and swallowed before they could finish. Every syllable trembled with urgency. "You'll understand by noon," he said. The repetition of that single phrase carried a weight that no explanation could match. Fear in this instance was both messenger and shield. It warned, guided, and prepared simultaneously. Her instinct screamed. She could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against her chest like the hand of a predator. The world outside her door appeared ordinary, the quiet suburban street, the streetlights fading with dawn, but beneath that ordinary veneer, she sensed the machinations of malice. This was not happenstance. This was premeditated, and he had been witness to a fragment of it, enough to terrify even a man trained to handle crises, enough to know that warning her was the only way to intervene. The trembling voice, the shaking hands, the avoidance of direct eye contact, all of it formed a language, a warning written in fear itself. She thought about the phrase again, "Just trust me." He didn't tell her why, because the explanation was too dangerous, too immediate. His eyes said what his lips could not. There are forces at work you don't understand. Forces that will destroy you if you step into them blindly. She could feel the gravity of it, the invisible pull of impending disaster that had already been set in motion. His fear was not theatrics, it was authentic, alive, and contagious, infecting her own veins with adrenaline and sharpened awareness. In those moments she understood that fear, when genuine and unadulterated, is far more instructive than any logic or planning. It bypasses reasoning and speaks directly to survival. She could read the narrative of the morning in his eyes. A plan carefully crafted, a trap laid for someone who followed their predictable routine, a timing designed to exploit her absence from safety. And she was that someone. The intensity of his gaze, the tremor in his voice, the urgency in his posture, they were all proof that someone had decided she should be removed, and that the plan was already unfolding. Every detail mattered. The quiver in his lip, the shallow rhythm of his breathing, the way his shoulders hunched as though bracing for invisible blows, these were not signs of weakness, they were signs of clarity. He had seen something that demanded an immediate response, something he could not fix, only attempt to mitigate by delivering her this warning. And the impact of that realization was profound. The fear in his eyes was not merely his own. It was a reflection of the severity of the threat, a mirror of the danger waiting for her if she ignored the warning. She closed the door slowly, trying to process what she had just witnessed, but the memory of his eyes stayed with her, burning like coals in her mind. Every twitch, every glance, every silent plea was etched into her memory. She realized that understanding the nature of fear is critical in times like this. It is not the paralysis that kills, but the ignorance of the warning embedded within fear. His terror had been a lifeline, a compass, a shield extended across the early morning darkness. Hours passed and the tension only grew. Every sound, car doors slamming, birds chirping, the distant hum of engines, seemed amplified, charged with potential menace. She kept replaying his face in her mind, dissecting every micro-expression, every subtle cue. His fear was a map, and she had to follow it without deviation. Ignoring it could mean walking straight into a meticulously orchestrated disaster. The way he had refused to speak fully about the danger had made it more real, more terrifying, more urgent. He had witnessed the storm before it struck, and now she would navigate it armed with his panic as her guide. By the time the clock ticked closer to noon, she had internalized every detail. Fear, she understood, was not a weakness, it was a message. The trembling in his hands, the rapid blinking, the tightness in his chest, all of it communicated what words could not. And as she moved through her house with deliberate caution, checking locks, peering through blinds, and listening intently, she realized that the most potent truths often come from those who fear the consequences of revealing them. The fear in his eyes had reshaped her understanding of danger. It had transformed abstract suspicion into urgent awareness. She no longer needed explanations, for his terror had already conveyed the depth of the threat. Trusting it meant survival, ignoring it meant death. And in that still, early morning silence, she knew she had been given a gift, the foresight to avoid a trap that could have ended everything. His eyes, wide and haunted, had been the first alarm, a beacon signaling that the world outside her door was far more lethal than it seemed. By 11:30 a.m., when the police call came confirming the setup, she would understand fully the magnitude of the threat. But at 5 a.m., in the frozen light of dawn, the fear in his eyes had already prepared her for what was coming. It had sharpened her instincts, heightened her senses, and given her the first chance at survival. That fear was not weakness. It was the most powerful weapon she had ever seen, wielded not in malice, but in desperate hope that she would heed it and live to fight back. The minutes passed like heavy lead, each tick of the clock reverberating through her body, a drumbeat of suspense and inevitability. Every second brought her closer to the truth, closer to the moment when all the invisible threads of danger would snap into reality. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach, a mix of dread and focus, that told her the morning's events were a prelude to something catastrophic. Noon was not just a time, it was a deadline, a culmination. A trap set with precision, timing, and meticulous calculation. Every hour that led to it stretched into an eternity of anticipation, fear, and mental preparation. By 6 a.m., she had barricaded her mind with vigilance. Every sound outside magnified, every shadow a potential threat. She went over her routine mentally, considering what could be waiting for her if she left for work, retracing every step she would have taken, every possible exposure to danger. It was as though the world had been laid out as a board game, with her movements anticipated, measured, and manipulated, and now she existed in the pause before the first domino fell. By 7 a.m., every small detail in her house, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of curtains, the faint glow of streetlights fading, became meaningful. Each noise could signal approach, each movement could reveal intent. Her neighbor's warning at 5 a.m. was not just a suggestion, it had become the blueprint for her survival. He had glimpsed the storm before it arrived, and now she was using that insight to navigate the peril that had already begun to converge around her life. By 8 a.m., the hours felt stretched impossibly long, each tick amplifying tension. She reviewed relationships, recent conflicts at work, even minor arguments that in retrospect seemed loaded with meaning. Certain colleagues had been unusually attentive, others unusually distant. The inconsistencies, the quiet murmurs, the strange glances, all took on new significance under the pressure of the impending threat. Someone had studied her patterns, her habits, and now her survival depended on recognizing these patterns and exploiting them to her advantage. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the gravity of the situation sharpened into clarity. This was no accident, no random act of violence. It was deliberate, targeted, designed for her. Each minute leading to noon became a strategic calculation. How could she remain unseen? How could she avoid detection? How could she transform fear into a weapon that would preserve her life and give her the advantage over whoever had plotted her demise? She moved through her home with methodical precision, examining locks, doors, and windows, preparing herself mentally for the confrontation that was approaching like a hurricane on the horizon. By 10 a.m., anticipation had evolved into controlled vigilance. She reviewed the warning, replaying the look of terror in her neighbor's eyes, the tremor in his voice, The cryptic words, "You'll understand by noon." His fear had been a map, now it was her guide. She began imagining every possible scenario, every route of escape, every potential confrontation. The world outside remained deceptively ordinary, but she knew ordinary was the mask covering calculated malevolence. At 10:30 a.m., every heartbeat seemed magnified, every breath a countdown. The tension had grown so thick it was nearly tangible, a physical weight pressing against her chest. She felt herself teetering on the edge of inevitability, aware that survival depended on vigilance, calculation, and the ability to act decisively when the moment arrived. Noon was approaching, and with it, the culmination of the trap laid out for her. By 11:15 a.m., the air seemed electric, charged with anticipation and dread. She moved through her home with fluid precision, mentally running through every contingency. The quiet street outside, the fading glow of the morning sky, the subtle sounds of early traffic, all were part of the tableau she had to navigate. Each second was a reminder of the fragility of life and the precision of those who had plotted against her. Then, at 11:30 a.m., the phone rang. It was the police. The moment the detective's voice confirmed the attack and her targeted status, the tension of the countdown crystallized into reality. Every second of anticipation, every anxious calculation, every mental preparation had led to this. She understood fully the danger she had avoided by heeding the 5 a.m. warning. The trap had been laid with meticulous planning, but her vigilance had dismantled it before it could strike. The countdown to noon was not just a measure of time, it had been a test of awareness, intuition, and resolve. It had forced her to examine every detail of her life, to anticipate every move, and to prepare for the unthinkable. And when the clock struck that fateful hour, she stood not as a victim, but as a survivor, sharpened, alert, and ready to confront the betrayal that had lurked in the shadows. The phone rang sharply, cutting through the tense stillness that had enveloped her since the 5 a.m. warning. Each ring echoed like a drumbeat in her chest, a percussion of fate that demanded immediate attention. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before snatching the receiver, her hand trembling with a mixture of anticipation, fear, and a strange, growing clarity. "Hello." Her voice was steady, but inside, her pulse had accelerated to a rhythm that mirrored the pounding of her heart. On the other end came a voice she had learned to recognize as authority, the calm yet urgent timbre of a law enforcement officer. "Mom, this is Detective Harris. Are you currently at work?" The question should have been routine, but the way it was delivered made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There was no preamble, no small talk, only a stark clinical inquiry that implied urgency far beyond normal circumstances. She answered slowly, deliberately, "No, I'm at home." A pause followed, longer than necessary, charged with the weight of unspoken realities. Then, "Good. That's good," he said, but the relief in his tone was not casual, it was measured, cautious, like a man checking the pulse of someone who had been near death. Her mind raced, trying to parse the significance of the interaction. The morning had already been a crucible of tension. Every hour since the 5 a.m. warning had been an exercise in vigilance. Now, this call suggested that the danger she had sensed, the shadow lurking behind normalcy, was not only real, it was active. The detective continued, his voice controlled but deliberate. "There's been an incident at your workplace this morning. Multiple assailants attempted to force entry. Several employees were injured. The operation appeared targeted, and your name was included in the list of intended victims." Every word struck like a hammer against the fragile shell of her perception, each syllable a cold shard of reality slicing through disbelief. Her mind reeled. The meticulous warnings from her neighbor, the anxiety, the adrenaline of waiting, all of it had led to this apex, the revelation that the threat had been calculated, precise, and deadly. She was not just being warned. She had been marked. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, feeling the smooth wood dig into her fingers, as if to anchor herself against the storm unfolding within her. The details spilled out slowly, carefully, as though the detective weighed every syllable to avoid panic, yet the gravity was unavoidable. Every plan, every preparation, every tremor in her neighbor's voice converged into one undeniable truth. Someone had orchestrated a scenario that would have placed her directly in harm's way. It was not random, nor was it chaotic. It was designed to eliminate her, or at the very least, frame her for something far worse than mere misfortune. The phone call revealed the chilling efficiency of the plot. Evidence had been collected, communications intercepted, and timing calculated down to the minute. The intention was clear. She was meant to walk into a trap precisely aligned with her routine, predictable and unalterable. Her survival had hinged entirely on the intervention of a terrified neighbor at 5 a.m., whose trembling warning had been the only barrier between life and obliteration. The detective's explanation made it explicit that had she followed her usual schedule, she would have been among the primary targets, an unfortunate statistic in a plan executed with ruthless precision. As she listened, comprehension dawned in layers, each revelation sharpening the edge of her focus. The phone call was not simply a message of danger, it was a manifestation of betrayal and conspiracy, a framework built by individuals who had exploited knowledge of her habits and vulnerabilities. Every ordinary day, every routine action she had taken for granted, had been monitored, measured, and manipulated to serve a hidden purpose. The ordinary world outside her home, the quiet streets, the fading morning light, everything that had seemed safe now bore the weight of the unseen orchestration designed to ensnare her. The realization sparked a cold clarity. This was no longer about fear or uncertainty, it was about awareness and response. The call had transformed panic into information, anxiety into strategy. She was being told, definitively, that the morning's events were a setup, a plot that had relied on the precise alignment of circumstance, timing, and complacency. But she had survived. She had been given knowledge that no ordinary routine could provide, a second chance through the intervention of fear channeled by her neighbor. Every tremor in his hands, every hesitation in his voice, now made sense. They had been signals, an unspoken map pointing to survival. The detective continued, explaining that while the attack had targeted multiple individuals, the structure of the plan suggested premeditation of an extreme nature. Documents had been forged, schedules manipulated, and communications carefully timed to ensure compliance with the conspirators' expectations. Her name appearing on the list of intended victims was not accidental. It was symbolic of the broader strategy. Remove a variable that threatened exposure or interfere with the perpetrator's ultimate goal. Every sentence from the detective's mouth painted a portrait of meticulous criminal calculation, a web spun with sinister precision, designed to entrap her in a scenario where escape seemed improbable without outside intervention. By the end of the call, she understood fully she had been in mortal danger. The 5 a.m. warning from her neighbor, previously a source of anxiety and confusion, now crystallized into a lifeline, a tangible factor that had altered the outcome of her morning, indeed her life. The police call had not merely confirmed the threat, it had contextualized it, transforming the abstract sense of dread into a concrete understanding of deliberate orchestration. It was a revelation that instilled not only relief, but resolute determination. Knowing the setup existed, knowing it had failed only because of her neighbor's fear, she realized the power now rested with her awareness and strategic decision-making. She hung up the phone, letting the weight of the information settle. Her hands were steady now, her mind sharpened. The danger was real, the attack calculated, and the conspirators had assumed she would follow routine unquestioningly. But the police call had exposed their plan, unveiled the framework, and allowed her a chance to reclaim control over a situation that had been designed to strip it away. The 11:30 a.m. call was more than a warning, it was the turning point, the moment when knowledge replaced fear, clarity replaced panic, and the first seeds of revenge began to take root. Survival was no longer passive, it had become active, informed, and purposeful. Every element of the setup, the timing, the targeting, the intended manipulation, was now a map of opportunity. The conspirators had underestimated her capacity for awareness, resilience, and calculated response. The phone call had illuminated the shadowed corners of the conspiracy, exposing vulnerabilities in the plot itself. It had shifted the narrative from one of helplessness to one of potential empowerment, from victimhood to strategic advantage. The setup had failed not because she was lucky, but because knowledge had intervened at the most critical moment. And with that knowledge came the first spark of justice, a spark that would ignite the flames of a revenge meticulously planned, coldly executed, and undeniably effective. The police call at 11:30 a.m. was no ordinary notification. It was the fulcrum on which the entire story of betrayal, fear, and survival pivoted. It revealed the stakes, the players, and the timing. It provided proof of intent and exposure of the criminal orchestration. Most importantly, it crystallized the path forward. The threat could be countered, the conspirators could be confronted, and the scales could be tipped in her favor. It was the first tangible confirmation that the unseen, the feared, and the whispered had been real, and that survival was possible. And in that moment, with the line still warm in her hand, she understood that the power of knowledge was not just defensive, it was the first weapon in her arsenal of retribution. The truth, when it revealed itself, carried a weight heavier than any fear she had felt that morning. It was not strangers lurking in shadows or faceless criminals orchestrating chaos from afar. No, the betrayal was far closer, far more intimate, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone she had trusted implicitly, someone whose presence had been a fixture in her daily life, had conspired against her. The revelation was like a blade sliding slowly across her consciousness, cutting through every comforting assumption she had ever held about loyalty, family, and friendship. The betrayal was insidious, meticulously hidden beneath layers of pretense, smiles, and routine interactions. She had walked past the signs, the subtle manipulations, the whispers she had dismissed as inconsequential. Now, every detail she had overlooked, the sudden interest in her schedule, the innocuous questions that seemed offhand, the almost imperceptible monitoring of her routines, came into sharp focus, forming a horrifying mosaic of calculated malice. Her mind raced as the implications sank in. The person who had betrayed her was not acting alone in the abstract. They had relied on her predictable habits, her trust, and her consistency. They had assumed that by the time the trap sprung at her workplace, she would be exactly where she normally was. Immersed in the rhythms of a day she considered safe and ordinary. It was a cruel irony, the very routines that had structured her life, that had brought comfort and rhythm, were weaponized against her. And the coldest truth of all, the most devastating element of the betrayal, was the intimate knowledge required to execute such a plan. Only someone who had walked beside her, shared her space, and observed her closely could have orchestrated the timing with such lethal precision. The enemy had worn a familiar face. She replayed memories of recent weeks, moments that had seemed trivial at the time. There had been glances that lingered too long, questions that seemed innocent but carried subtle undertones of calculation, invitations to casual meetings that now, in hindsight, felt like reconnaissance. Conversations abruptly cut off when she entered the room. The thought that the very hands she had shaken in friendship, the very voice she had trusted for advice, were instruments in a plot designed to destroy her, it was a psychological blow unlike any other. Every memory was now tinged with suspicion, every gesture potentially loaded with malevolence. The person she had considered an ally, perhaps even a friend, was the architect of her near demise. The psychological impact was profound. Trust, once the foundation of her interactions, had been weaponized. The betrayal struck not just at her physical safety, but at the core of her perception of reality. She realized that survival alone would not be enough. She needed clarity, strategy, and the ability to dismantle the plot entirely. The intimate nature of the betrayal demanded a response measured not by emotion alone, but by precision, foresight, and tactical brilliance. This was no longer a game of mere reaction, it was a chess match, and the stakes were life and death. Every decision she had made, every move the conspirator had anticipated, had been designed to leave her vulnerable. The exposure of this inner betrayal transformed fear into purpose, urgency into strategy. She began to trace the chain of actions that had led to the setup. Emails that had been slightly altered, financial discrepancies she had noted but not acted upon, casual remarks twisted into potential misinformation, all pointed to the insider's deliberate orchestration. The plot had been executed with meticulous planning, relying on the precision of timing and intimate knowledge of her habits. The 5 a.m. warning from her neighbor, the police call at 11:30 a.m., the panic, the adrenaline. It was all part of a sequence that highlighted the conspirators' reliance on her expected compliance. And yet, the exposure of the betrayal offered her the first significant advantage: knowledge. Knowledge transformed her fear into controlled energy. The realization that the danger had come from someone close, someone she had trusted implicitly, did not merely terrify her, it focused her mind. It illuminated the vulnerabilities she needed to protect, the potential moves she could make, and the timing of her counteractions. The betrayal, as devastating as it was, became the blueprint for her survival and eventual revenge. She understood now that emotional pain, when harnessed with clarity and precision, could become a weapon as powerful as any physical defense. Each element of the conspirators' plan, the surveillance, the timing, the manipulation, was now a set of predictable variables. She could anticipate their expectations, calculate their next moves, and exploit the very assumptions that had nearly led to her destruction. The betrayal had been intended to isolate her, to leave her vulnerable at a critical juncture. But with this revelation, she found herself equipped not only with awareness, but with the potential to invert the power dynamic entirely. The conspirator had relied on her compliance, her predictability, her ignorance. Now, armed with knowledge and resolve, she could turn their own designs against them. By midday, the psychological weight of the betrayal had solidified into determination. The person who had sought to control, manipulate, and endanger her had underestimated one crucial factor: her resilience, her intelligence, and her capacity for calculated retribution. The betrayal had exposed weaknesses in the plot, revealing patterns, timing, and dependencies that she could exploit. Every move she made from that moment forward was informed by insight gained from the very treachery that had nearly destroyed her. The betrayal, once a source of fear and despair, had become the catalyst for empowerment, strategy, and ultimate vengeance. The most profound realization came as she reflected on the intimate nature of the conspiracy. Trust, once weaponized, could now be reclaimed. She no longer needed to wonder who to fear; she knew the face behind the threat. And with that knowledge came the power to act deliberately, decisively, and mercilessly. She had been targeted, betrayed, and nearly eliminated, yet the very act of betrayal had provided her with the tools to outmaneuver the enemy, to reclaim control, and to exact justice on her own terms. The path forward was clear: she would use the betrayal as both shield and weapon, transforming near-death experience into strategic empowerment, and ultimately into a cold, undeniable form of revenge. The betrayal from the inside was devastating in its intimacy, but it was also the very mechanism that ensured her eventual triumph. It forced her to recognize vulnerabilities, sharpen instincts, and embrace the clarity that comes when life and trust are weaponized against you. And as she prepared for the next steps, she understood a critical truth: the deeper the betrayal, the more potent the revenge. The insider's trust had been broken, but that same broken trust would be the instrument through which she reclaimed power, exposed the true villain, and demonstrated that survival and vengeance are intertwined when courage meets calculated action. The moment the betrayal was fully exposed, a cold fire ignited inside her, a fire that consumed fear and transformed it into unrelenting purpose. Survival alone was no longer sufficient. The stakes demanded action, precision, and retribution. She had been targeted, manipulated, and nearly eliminated, and the only appropriate response was revenge executed with strategic brilliance. This was not the impulsive, emotional revenge born of anger alone. It was the kind forged in the crucible of fear, betrayal, and survival, a calculated response designed to dismantle the conspirator's life piece by piece. Every action, every decision, would be deliberate, measured, and unavoidable. She began by documenting every detail, every inconsistency, every piece of evidence that linked the betrayal to the conspirator. Emails, financial records, text messages, security logs, nothing was too small to examine. She knew that precision was critical. Any misstep could compromise the plan, dilute the impact, or alert the enemy to her intentions. Her eyes, once wide with fear at the neighbor's 5 a.m. warning, were now narrowed with focus, scanning, analyzing, and calculating. This was the transformation from victim to tactician, from prey to predator. The first step in her revenge was exposure. The conspirator had relied on secrecy, on the assumption that her absence from the office would prevent her from discovering the plot. They had counted on predictability, on routine, on complacency. But the very warning that saved her life now became the foundation for dismantling their scheme. She sent verified evidence to the authorities, ensuring that their complicity was recorded and undeniable. Yet she didn't stop there. Legal exposure alone was insufficient. The revenge had to be personal, precise, and psychologically devastating. She needed them to feel the collapse of the world they had tried to engineer. Next came manipulation of perception. She created scenarios that mirrored the threat she had faced, subtly inserting doubt, confusion, and fear into the conspirators' carefully orchestrated life. They had assumed she would be vulnerable and unaware. Now she became the architect of uncertainty. Every interaction, every message, every subtle action was calculated to reveal that she had not only survived, but mastered the battlefield they had tried to dominate. The psychological warfare was as potent as any tangible strike, undermining confidence and instilling a creeping dread that mirrored the terror she had felt at 5 a.m. Her final act of revenge was the reclaiming of power. She confronted the conspirator, armed not with emotion alone, but with irrefutable evidence, strategic control, and unshakable authority. The confrontation was deliberate, surgical, and inescapable. Every word, every gesture, every revelation was timed to maximize impact, leaving the conspirator exposed and humiliated, stripped of the control they had assumed. Justice was served not through chaos, but through the exacting force of calculated action. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy her became the very mechanism of their undoing. By the end, she stood victorious, not merely as a survivor, but as an empowered force of reckoning. The fear that had once guided her neighbor's trembling warning, the calculated betrayal from within, and the deadly precision of the plot against her all converged into a singular outcome: the conspirators' collapse. Revenge in its coldest, most strategic form had been executed flawlessly. She had turned fear into power, betrayal into opportunity, and survival into triumph. Her eyes, once wide with terror, now reflected only clarity and determination. The storm had passed, the enemy dismantled, and the balance restored. Survival had been the beginning, but revenge was the conclusion. A meticulously crafted fire-for-fire reckoning that left no doubt of her strength, intelligence, and indomitable will. In the end, she had not just survived, she had conquered, transforming fear, betrayal, and near-death experience into an unassailable fortress of power and retribution. Betrayal punished, justice served. Subscribe now to witness more real-life, jaw-dropping revenge stories unfold.